Hello, everyone. It's Leslie Appleton-Young here with the October edition of Coffee and Conversations, and it's going to be a very special session today because I'm going to be interviewing my number one favorite economist in the entire country world, who always has a great outlook, an interesting perspective, and lots to say. So buckle your buckle your seat belts and let's get going. Anyway, my guest this afternoon is John Tucillo. And for those of you that don't know, John is a real estate economist. I would say he's the premier housing market economist in the country. He is also an author. Many of you may have been exposed to John when he was at the National Association of Realtors, their chief economist in the mid 80s to the mid 90s, which is when I first met him as well. Anyway, he has incredible academic credentials. He went to Georgetown. He got his PhD from Cornell, came back and taught at Georgetown for almost a decade. He was at Brookings. He was the chief economist for the National Council of Savings Institutions. And as I already mentioned, he was with the National Association of Realtors as their chief economist, and then went on to be a well-known consultant. He's written quite a few books that I would have to say they're ahead of his time, right? He wrote Click to Close with Jim Sherry almost 25 years ago, The 8 New Rules of Real Estate, The Business Rules of Real Estate. So he's really got a very deep background, if you will. And in addition to all of that, he's written 4 crime novels that are available for Kindle on Amazon if you're interested in following the protagonist through the twists and turns of solving murders. So anyway, with that, John, come over here on the bench and join me. And I want to introduce you to the Women Up audience. I think first Women Up that you attended was in 2018.
18,
In
yes.
2000, what did you think?
I was blown away. It was just phenomenal. It was just incredible.
Yeah.
The amount of just spirit, aura that was there was just overwhelming.
Right. Well, you've seen me do this show for the last 2 years, 2 years from home. How does it feel to be my guest finally?
I'm nervous.
You're nervous.
I'm very nervous.
I do want to tell you, all the years that John was NAR chief economist, California never invited him to California to give a speech for the California Association of Realtors. And I've been paying for that ever since. So anyway, let's get started. There's so much happening in the economy, in the housing market. Everybody's a little bit worried from 0 to 10, right? We just kind of aren't clear where things are headed. So John, why don't we start, just give us a little bit of a kind of an outline of how you see real estate in 2023.
Well, I don't think the economy in real estate is going to have a very happy year
Hold on. There we go.
A very happy year in 2023 for a variety of reasons. I think the official government speak is that the economy is leaning into the wind. Well, there are a lot of winds in there, and we can just tick them off. Interest rates are up, and they're probably going to stay up through most of 2023. Inflation is high, and it's going to be coming down in 2023, but not to the point where we're really happy again. GDP growth will be very slow. The rest of the world is going into recession. The trade sector in the US will be particularly hurt by a very strong dollar and by that recession in the rest of the world. So I think all the factors are lining up for a year that is, I would say, ultimately forgettable in economic terms. And of course, with high interest rates, the housing market's going to be hampered as well. And we've seen that. We've seen a precipitous drop in sales. We've seen the market slow down all over the country. But yet we haven't seen prices come down. And that's the interesting point. For some reason, I think I know why, I'll tell you in a second. For some reason, we're really looking at prices being sticky downward. And that's a function of scarcity. Even though demand is dying off, supply isn't increasing. So what you've got is a pretty inelastic supply of housing. And as demand falls, sales will fall, but prices will not. So we're looking at a year in which prices will probably wind up increasing year over year, not by what they have been, not by double digits, but certainly increasing year over year.
You're talking about 2022?
2022 and
Oh,
2023.
2023. Okay.
Yeah.
So, when you said prices are sticky on the way down, it reminded me of giving speeches in the couple of years heading into the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, and 2009. And the argument then was, and I think it is today, right, that if people don't have to sell, they don't, right? So then the question becomes, well, what happened in 2007, 8, and 9 where everybody had to sell?
Well, I think the difference is in financing right now. There are two differences. One is in financing. It's a lot harder to get a mortgage now. So the people who've got mortgages when they're at 2.5 and 3 and 3.5, right, are good credit risks, as opposed to the fog and mirror loans that we saw in 06 and 07. So what happens is that folks are responsible citizens. But the second thing that happened is that with the big run up of prices over the last 3 years, people now have very strong equity cushions, which means that even if they're forced into foreclosure, which is which is a very rare occurrence, even if they miss mortgage payments, they have a sufficient equity cushion in their house so they can sell it and still come out of it whole. Now, finding another place to live is another question. But I think we can put aside fears of a housing collapse like we saw in the middle of the last decade, because the conditions are completely different. This is a very, very solid market that unfortunately doesn't have enough supply to go around.
Well, I think the other aspect of that, though, is what if the housing market is impacted by a major recession, right? And we've been watching the Fed for quite a long time. They started increasing rates in March of this year. And what I'm reading is the Fed is going to have to crack the job market, i.e., we're going to start to see the unemployment rate go up before we start seeing inflation go down, right? Their measure of demand shrinking, which is what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to depress demand, is going to mean that people are out of jobs. And that's what happened last time. In addition to they had no equity, they were underwater right away, is we also had a lot of people losing their jobs. So I'm just interested how you can kind of discount the job story. I'm taking it a little more seriously.
I don't discount the job story. I fully believe the Fed is going to cause a recession. The Fed is going to miss their target, because they always do. All right. Sometimes they miss it on the wrong side, low. Sometimes they miss it high. This time they can miss it high. They'll keep raising interest rates until the economy collapses. And I can understand why, because in the pipeline right now is lower inflation. Oil prices are down. That's a big number. Okay. Food prices are sticky, but they seem to be stabilizing. The price of goods and services is going down simply because producers and retailers are overstocked, and you're going to see huge discounts this holiday season. I mean, bigger than ever. And they just need to get rid of product, and because of that, goods prices are going to go down. Supply chains are opening up. They're loosening up. It's a lot cheaper now to send a container full of cargo from China to the West Coast of the United States. All these things are in the pipeline. They're not going away. They just haven't showed up yet.
Well, and all that being said, let's kind of dive into why the inflation number is so high, right? And is part of that because of housing, right? And I remember way back when inflation was still 2-3%, and you had housing prices going up and rents going up at double-digit rates. It was like, what's going on here? So was there a lag getting the housing data into the CPI, and now there's going to be a lag getting the data out of CPI? So is that one of the reasons why it's still 8.3%, the latest reading, right? We're not seeing signs of the slowdown you're talking about quite yet.
Well, I'll give you a technical answer to that. Yes. Um, Basically, the CPI uses a rent proxy to measure housing costs. Doesn't use house prices. It doesn't really use even market rents. It uses a proxy. In other words, what would this house rent for
Right.
if the owner rented it out? Right. And that's kind of a real weak, I mean, we're really weak measure. Over the years, that measure has been revisited over and over again. It's probably the weakest point in the CPI calculation. And I really do believe, given what I see happening in the ownership market and in the rental market, I really do believe that there is a moderating housing element in the inflation number, and that number hasn't yet come out. It would not surprise me to see in December, not necessarily November, but in December and January, begin to see inflation really begin to come down noticeably.
So given that the Fed is still expected to increase the funds rate by 75 basis points at their next meeting, which is November 1st and 2nd, do you see kind of inflation coming down and the Fed continuing to tighten to a kind of a dire end, if you will, a couple months down the road?
Well, I think the entire open market committee thinks it's Paul Volcker, and therefore they have to emulate him, and they have to crush the economy in order to crush inflation. That's bananas. That's a polite word. I didn't want to use the real word.
I appreciate it.
That's really bananas.
There are maybe children watching this program.
Thank you. Or people, never mind. That's not necessary. The Fed probably needs one more 75 point increase, 75 basis point increase. After that, it can start tapering down. If I ruled the world, it'd be 75 in November, maybe another 50 in December, then 25. And then I'd step back and see what happens.
So are you saying that we could still see a mild recession, AKA a soft landing next year? I mean, are we going to avoid unemployment, doubling in some of these other scenarios that we're seeing out there?
Well, it's a tough question to answer. I see a recession. I don't see a long one. I don't see a deep one. But the unemployment rate will go up. It's what, 3.5% now, double to 7? Not quite. I think maybe it'll go to 5 or 6. And at that point, people will realize that, hey, look, it's enough. And the Fed will have to stop. And I would guess, and this is just, purely my conjecture, by the end of 2023, we'll see the Fed easing off a little bit. Now, you've got to remember, too, what's interesting here is that the federal government's contribution to the economy is decreasing. No matter what you hear politically, the deficit is half what it was, right? Which means that the injection of money or funds of spending power into the economy on the part of the federal government, the fiscal policy of the federal government, is restrictive, or more restrictive than it has been. And if we go into recession, I don't think the government's going to bail anybody out again. They just, they've been through that. We've done that. We've done enough. And when
So it's going to be a rough ride for people.
Yeah, when you add restrictive monetary policy to restrictive fiscal policy, you almost always get recession. And you got to take that into account. What people don't realize is the degree to which the federal government has cut back spending. All right. Now, the other thing is that the federal government's also indexing income taxes for inflation there, which means you're not going to get a tax break because of inflation. You're going to be paying as much as you would have 3 or 4 years ago, not less because of inflation. So the net of this is that we see monetary policy and restrictive policy, both monetary and fiscal policy being restrictive And I think that's going to head us into recession.
Okay, so let's go back and talk about mortgage rates for a minute. So we've seen almost a doubling of rates in the last year or so, right?
More than
so
doubling.
more than doubling. I mean, it's been very dramatic. So you're an agent and you're meeting with clients who are very interested, or at least before the party ended, right? We're very interested in selling their homes or in first-time buyers buying their homes. How do you counsel them in this environment? Do you say, look, buy the house, date the rate, don't, if you can qualify, just get ready to refi when we get out of this? Or is it time to just sit on the sidelines? I mean, honestly, what would be your assessment of what to do?
I don't think I have to give sellers any advice. Right? If you're sitting on a 3.5% mortgage in a 7% world, you're crazy not to stay with it.
Right.
And we're seeing tenure increasing. People are staying in their houses longer now. Why? Because they've got sweetheart deals on their mortgages.
Right. And that's why we haven't seen an increase in new listings
Right.
like we thought we might
Right.
in this last year.
Right.
They're not there because there's no financial incentive. In fact, there's a disincentive
Right.
to change.
That's
right now.
absolutely correct.
Yeah.
If I'm going to counsel buyers, I'll tell them what you just said. Love the house, date the rate. And if you find a place that is affordable and meets your criteria, don't worry about the rate 7%. Eventually it's going to go back down and you're going to be able to refinance. But at the moment, right, it's the old saying, when's the best time to buy a house? 10 years ago. When's the next best time? Today. So I think what you've got is that's the advice I would give buyers. I think if they can get into the game, they need to get into the game. There's no two ways about it.
Right.
If they can't, now the problem is a lot of people can't get into the game anymore. And that ripples through the housing system because essentially, if you don't have affordable housing, first of all, it's stuck. People are locked into their homes by low mortgages. Those homes do not come into the market. Supply is restricted. Prices stay high. People can't afford the prices. They have to either rent, or if they own, stay where they are, double up if they have to, move back in with their parents, a whole bunch of things, which completely disrupts the whole housing ladder. Not to mention what happens at the bottom of that ladder. We have no way of getting homeless people into shelter with pride and et cetera, all the way up.
I think the other aspect of that is just renters, right? That renters are looking at a doubling. I mean, the increases in rents have been absolutely enormous. And how do you stay for a down payment when you're paying 25-30% more in rent than you were before? So it's really kind of freezing that aspect as well. And this is, again, another thing that we didn't see in 2004, 5, 6, and 7. As those housing prices went up, rent stayed relatively flat, right? So this really was a speculative activity in the housing market, not the rental market. What is different today is that we have seen very similar increases in rents as we have seen in housing prices. So this is kind of a shortage across the board. And certainly, at least until recently, it was a shared experience throughout the country. This wasn't like a coastal phenomena and the rest of the country was doing okay, right? It really permeated the entire housing market.
Well, I think there are two things. One is you're going to see a sharp increase in tolerance for obnoxious roommates. Because people are going to be doubling up. How do you afford rising rents? You take on somebody you wouldn't take on in normal times.
Right. Right.
So what? So your roommate's got a drum set and practices endlessly. You walk the streets, have a cup of coffee, don't be home. But that roommate's picking up half the rent, so therefore you can afford that rent. But the second thing I think I talk about is this. As it was in 7 and 8 and 9, large entities are picking up large numbers of rental units. Now, in those years, it was financial funds. Financial entities put together funds which would finance the purchase of foreclosed homes to be used as rental properties. Now it's become a regular business. Now you
Right.
see a lot of companies which are out there buying 10, 20, 40, 60, 100 units and renting them out. Now, the difference here is this. Even though market rents may be going up as a whole, that increase is largely the function of onesie twosie owners. The large companies that own hundreds and thousands of units are not raising rents that much. And the reason is they don't need it. They don't need to. They can live off of small margins and a high volume. Onesie twosie owners can't do that. They have to account for the inflation in the products and services they buy in the rents they charge their tenants. So I think you've got a little bit of a moderating element in the rental market in the sense that corporate ownership is less inflationary than is the onesie twosie owners.
Right, before we leave mortgage rates, I just want to go back one more time. And I know, you can't do a confident single point forecast on anything these days, but how long do you think, try me? Just thinking about obnoxious roommates, but anyway, it's like, so one of the questions that we got was, how long will it take the housing market to get back to whatever the new normal looks like? How much higher do you think mortgage rates are going to go? And how long will it take before things we take a breath and get back to a normal market? And I guess by that, I just mean that one that isn't gripped with uncertainty.
Well, I think one of the problems that will persist is scarcity of housing.
Yes.
I still suppose mortgage rates go down to 4.5%. If I'm sitting on a 3% mortgage, I'm still not going to move because it's still going to cost me more. Some people will. Okay. But I think if you're looking for a timeline, I'm going to say end of 23, beginning of 24, we'll get back to a market that looks more in balance than it is now. Market has been wildly out of balance for 2 years. It's now correcting itself, and I suspect it'll get back to that balance that occurred before the pandemic, that balance by the end of 23, beginning of 24.
Right. And I think you bring up a really good point. When you look at year over year changes between 2022 and 2021, they're crazy numbers, right? Because the housing market beginning in about April or May of 2020 through, March of last year was just nutty. And we talked about it, right? This is not sustainable. We are looking at mortgage rates that are at a 50-year low. I mean, this is not going to go on forever. And honestly, it really didn't go on. It didn't go on forever. So I think that's a really good point to just keep in mind the context of the market today, and maybe don't look at last year as much as you look at maybe 2 years ago as the last year before the pandemic. And that gives you, I think, a lot more perspective on the market today. Is not that bad. It's like you're comparing it to something that wasn't really real.
I agree. I also want to point out that one of the other things about this market is that if you were a seller, it took virtually no time for you to sell your home. That's worth something.
Yeah.
Time is.
Looks like we may have temporarily lost Leslie and John. I'm sure they'll jump back on here.
Hi, welcome back. As I was saying, time is money. And the fact that you could sell your house in virtually an instant during the course of the run-up prices added a cherry on top of the ice cream sundae. And I think right now, you're not only getting to a more difficult market for sellers and buyers, but you're getting into a market where the anxiety and the inconvenience and the time involved in selling or buying a property goes back to where it was. And that's going to be if not a rude shock, certainly an increased pain for those in the market.
Well, and not just clients, but also realtors. We have so many realtors who are relatively new to the business that don't remember '07 or '08, did not live through that experience and maybe just came into the market 4 or 5 years ago. And then all of a sudden you've had this big, big change. So I'm really noticing a difference between how people that have been around a long time are processing what's going on right now and the newbies who are just like, wow, what happened?
I'm afraid for them. I'm really afraid for them. I think probably if you've come into the business after the Great Recession and you've lived through this boom period, and now you're seeing what's happening, right? The best thing you can do is find a veteran realtor and sit down with them and have them tell you what it was like and tell you what they learned and how they will be going to proceed through this period. Better yet, find somebody who was active in 1982 when mortgage rates were up to 20%.
I was talking earlier this year to our realtor, Glenda Baker here in Atlanta, who's absolutely fabulous. And she was talking about some of her clients wanting to coming from California and having a lot of equity that they didn't think they would have to kind of put into houses here in Atlanta, and her making the point that I don't know if I can get you that price 2 years from now. And this is way before anything happened with inflation and the Fed and so on, but just kind of an experienced realtor understanding how the cycles go. And regardless of how unique the circumstances are each time around, they actually have a lot of similarities.
Well, this is kind of harsh to say, but if you're a new realtor and you haven't lived through something like this before and you don't tap into a veteran who has, you're toast.
Yeah.
There's no two ways about it.
You
You
really
won't be in the
need,
business in a year and a half.
yeah, you need a perspective. So one of the wonderful things about last week is that John and I were in Long Beach for just 48 hours to the CAR meetings and had the opportunity to go to the forecast lunch, which I spoke at for so many years, and hear Jordan Levine, who is CAR's new chief economist, and just enjoyed working with him for so many years. So he gave a fabulous forecast, and I want to just zero in on his sales and price forecast for 2023. And so CAR is projecting, compared to this year, that sales will be off 7.2% after dropping 19.2% this year. And in terms of prices, he's seeing prices fall next year in California by 8.8% after a 5.7% increase last year, which is actually a lot lower than it's been the prior 2 years. So essentially a slowdown in appreciation that turns negative in 2023. So I just wanted to see, John, one of the things that's so great talking to you is you have a much bigger perspective than just California. So how do you see the housing market, sales and prices playing out next year? Kind of compare and contrast what's going on in California.
Well, I don't know much about California because I was never invited there. But having said that, we're on a glide path, and Jordan's forecast, and by the way, that was one of the best forecast talks I've ever heard in my life. Kudos to Jordan. Big kudos to Jordan. But I think in relative terms, if you scale everything by differences in size and differences in history and where you've been and what your prices are and what they were, everybody's on the same glide path. If you were up 20, you may be down 10. If you're up 5, you may be down 2. But the fact of the matter is everybody's on the same glide path. Nationally, we're looking at weakening prices. And when I say weakening, I'm taking into account also how prices that go up, but not by nearly as much as they had. We're looking at weakening prices, and we're looking at drops, and I use that word explicitly, drops in sales volume. over the course of 2000, well, what's left of 2022 and 2023. California is not atypical, just of a greater magnitude because of it's got a higher median price, it had a higher rate of inflation, but everybody's in the same boat here. Just that the boat looks different from where you're sitting.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. And we kind of felt in California that we always kind of led the nation, like what happened to us first, kind of eventually spread over to the rest of the country. And I think that's happening to a certain degree in this case as well. Certainly the housing supply shortage and the affordability crisis. I mean, I was writing about that my entire career at CAR, and now you hear about it from all parts of the country.
Well, ironically, California did in fact lead the country here because there's been such an out-migration from California, both in terms of people who wanted to leave the state and people who were able to work remotely because of the pandemic and chose to leave the state. They exported their capital gains, or they've carried their capital gains with them into lower cost markets and boosted the price in those markets. You know, Glenda, who Leslie just referenced, talks about crazy money coming into Atlanta. Well, it's Californians who are taking their huge capital gains and bringing it here. It's true in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Nevada to a certain extent, all over the West. A lot of folks are moving to lower cost markets, smaller cities where the quality of life may be higher. But they're bringing their capital gains with them and they're bidding up the price of housing.
And all of a sudden, they're not lower cost markets anymore for the people that work and live there. And we talked about that, you know, we've always talked about that in California, right? I remember when people were going over the hill to Bakersfield, you know, 20 years ago, and what that was doing to the prices there. We had the same outmigration in the Inland Empire. You know, what we found is that the people in San Francisco moved to Sacramento, and the people in Sacramento moved out of state. The people in LA moved to the Inland Empire. The people in the Inland Empire moved out of state. And that phenomena that we've seen in California for over 10 years is now more of a national challenge.
Well,
I guess
it's certainly occurring in the Western US. And then on top of that, California is losing companies to lower cost, no corporate tax states.
Right.
And so California is sort of the incubator for economic excess.
So I think we would say that in many aspects, California is at an inflection point in many areas, right? Demographics, economics, public policy, how to deal with housing. I mean, there's just a lot that's coming together, you know, and the pandemic really kind of supercharged some changes that have been going on for a long time. And here we are kind of still groggy from all that. So we'll have to see how that goes. I did want to talk to you just because you have such a deep background in policy. What do you see happening on the policy front in 2023?
Well, I think I've talked about this. I see the Fed tapering off.
Right.
I don't understand why they're not looking at the pipeline as opposed to the current numbers. And I think that to me is a mystery. And I think that they're going to have to taper off at some point because they'll begin to see the fruits of their labor. So I see economic policy easing off, not becoming expansive, but certainly easing off to a more neutral stance in 2023. I also see fiscal policy moving into a more neutral stance, which means somewhat of a cutback in terms of fiscal restraint, but I see them moving to a more neutral stance. You're not going to see the cutting of checks the way we saw during the pandemic.
Right.
I think that's a thing of the past. Don't count on it. What's happening now is the government is looking to pull its reins in, and in doing so has sort of fallen into fiscal restraint.
And just to kind of sum up what we talked about housing prices just one more time. I mean, housing prices are coming down, but they're still going to be above where they were before the pandemic. And that's pretty certain because of the supply constraints. Right. So that's kind of that in a nutshell. I just want to make sure that we got that clear.
Well, California has a chronic supply constraint, and this is something which is going to take a huge effort to solve.
Yeah.
and it's not being solved at the moment.
Okay. What advice would you have for agents kind of looking at kind of a plan for 2023, how to navigate it, how to communicate with their clients? What would you encourage them to do to be successful next year?
Well, the first thing I do would be urge them to become financial experts. If you're going to get somebody into a house, you're going to have to be creative about how that transition is financed. Now, we don't have the kind of flexibility we had in the past because of higher lending standards, because of the general absence of things like ARMs, but you can be creative. I think you've got to pay attention to that. You've got to be creative in getting your people. And that's number one.
Right.
Number two is you've got to find a place where you have access to the easiest and highest powered technology possible, because your buyers are going to expect you to be knowledgeable. There's an old saying in real estate, you have to be as technologically knowledgeable as your least technologically as your most technologically knowledgeable customer, not least, most technologically knowledgeable customer, which means if you ain't there, find a customer who's not there either. So you've got to be careful about what your
Right.
what your chosen market is.
Right.
I think those are the two things which I'd say.
Okay, well, I think we've left you with hopefully some insights. Clearly, this is a period where forecasting into the future is really tough, right? We've just got so many moving parts and unknowns, and we're looking at Russia and the Ukraine. We're looking at the Saudis. We're looking at the recession in China. There's just a lot of things happening globally that are going to impact our economy that we can't foresee, don't have control over. So it's the best of times and the worst of times to be an economist, right? Because everybody has to keep touching base to see kind of what happened next. So John, I really appreciate your insights on all of that, and I encourage everyone to I don't know if they recorded it or not, but working through Jordan's slides from the expo luncheon last week would be worth your time. And it was excellent. And again, his main theme for me coming out of his report was context is everything, right? Don't look at the year over year change without looking at the 2-year change and the 3-year change. Understand the very unique experience the economy has just been through and what that's meant for the housing market to have rock bottom mortgage rates that we knew weren't going to last anyway. So one of the things that I do with Coffee and Conversations is at the end, I have a rapid fire questions. Now, John, I don't know if you're going to be able to do rapid fire because usually you're not the most succinct person I've ever known. So we'll kind of, you have a lot to say. So I'm going to just start and let us know what you think. So the first question is, how do you define success?
At my age, waking up in the morning. Is that succinct enough for you?
It's very succinct. Would you like to elaborate on that with another point?
Right now, as I age, my definitions of success become personal definitions and not business definitions. So it's my kids, my grandkids, my wife, and my health.
Yeah, I think that's very good. All right. What is the one memory that will stand out for you from the last 2 pandemic years?
The tremendous change, you're not going to expect this, the tremendous change that has overtaken entertainment. I believe that the movement toward streaming video away from public movie theaters and away from broadcast television has been really a game changer. And I think that was the biggest change and the biggest memory I think I'll take out of this.
Okay, I wasn't expecting that, but we certainly do enough streaming around here.
Yes, we do.
Okay, if you could go back and give yourself one piece of advice before starting your career, what would it be?
Pay more attention to the people around you and make sure that you are active in touching them.
all about relationships. Always,
Absolutely.
right? That reminds me of, well, I'll think about it in a minute. What about a morning ritual?
Ah,
Do you have a morning routine that sets you up for a good day?
yes, I do.
Oh, do tell.
No, I'm keeping it a secret. No, I get up and greet my lovely wife in the morning because she's usually up before me. Then I get a cup of coffee and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and I do the crossword puzzles in each. And then I read them both from cover to cover, and then I'm ready to go. But by that time, it's usually time for my nap. So it's a little
Don't
more
say that.
delayed.
But I will tell you, one of the really delights about being kind of semi-retired is being so old school, and getting these two newspapers every day and reading them and really having the luxury of actually reading things that maybe aren't finance and real estate. And I've really enjoyed that. And the one thing I wanted to mention earlier when we were talking about relationships was just a dear friend of both of ours, Richard Mendenhall. I'll never forget a speech he gave when he was the NAR president, I think in 2001. And he said, when people say it's not personal, it's business, he said, it's always personal. And I've never forgotten that. I have never forgotten that. And there's been so many times in my life when things have gotten a little dicey that you just pick up the telephone and you talk to somebody, and what I remember, we took us 10 years at CAR to get the contract signed to get MLS feeds from across the state. And I know when John was also the chief economist at the Florida Association for 5 years and set up their research function. And I remember there were a couple of MLSs that we thought they just like hated us. And we went out to lunch and had a great time, and it got signed and it was done. And I thought, oh my gosh, why didn't we do that earlier? Right? Just should have just talked to people and told them what we were doing.
Can I say something else?
Yes.
Leslie mentioned old things in the newspaper. I really prefer getting my news hard copy from newspapers. It may seem old school and antiquated, but it gives you the time to think about how you think about things. You're not getting blasted with someone else's opinion via electronics. You make up your own mind. You think about it. You decide within your own context what it is that's happening, and you go forward from there. The more print sources you read, the better off you are, because no one has the whole truth, but everybody has a piece of it. And so you got to stitch it together.
All right. Well, speaking of reading, I must say, John, you are one of the, if not the most well-read person I've ever known. You are always reading a book, and you finish 1 or 2 books a week, and it runs the gamut from World War II to World War II. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. It runs the gamut from a war to something else. But I really, could you share a couple of the titles that you've read recently that you think that really impacted you, that you think people might be worth taking a look at?
The Collected Speeches of Abraham Lincoln, one of the great stylists of the English language, and a man who, despite a lack of formal education, could see very deeply into the souls of humanity. It's a very, very insightful book. Outside of that, for pleasure reading anything by Michael Connelly.
Okay.
His Bosch series is terrific.
Oh, that's great. All right. Well, I think we've used up our time today, and it's been a delight to have you here. Is there anything that you'd like to, any parting thoughts or parting shots for the Women Up community as we close things out?
No, I believe if you just work hard. That's what I tell everybody. Work hard.
Well, I guess I just would also like to say, from the first minute that John got engaged with Women Up through me, he's been a supporter 100%, and would do anything. It's really been great. So if you could read me the questions that came up, I can't, I obviously unhook us when I try to look at the chat. So if you can maybe give us those. If you were going back to real estate, do you think the timing is bad? I'm not sure what that means. Going back to real estate as a career,
Well,
or active in the market?
real estate is never a bad career if you know how to work at it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of people in real estate don't know how to work at it. You've got to know your market. You've got to know the statistics. You've got to put it all in context. You've got to circulate widely, and not only with customers and clients, but also with fellow business professionals in other industries. So you get a big picture of what's going on. You've got to have a good human touch. Real estate's about two things, about people and information. Your technology gives you access to the information you need. Your people skills give you access to your client base. You compete with technology, you win with people. Second question is, I'd love to know what you think is the highest interest rate we're going to reach. Well, there's a lot of room between 7% and infinity. So, but I'm going to say 8.5% is probably the ceiling max reached in the first half of 23.
All right. Well, we will revisit that in the first half of 2023 and see what that looks like. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us, whether you're here with us live or you're listening to this on a replay. It's been just the highlight of my career to be involved in Women Up, and it's been the highlight of my life to be married to John Tucillo, and I'm so happy he's here with us today. So thank you all very, very much for being here.
And thank you for having me. Does this count as an invitation from CAI?
It does.
Thank you. Finally, yay me.
Invitation. Thanks, everyone.